Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to your first of your last 3 flips that we're going to be using to kind of crash course ourselves in Unit 9 in the AP European curriculum, which is Cold War and Contemporary Europe, right? So what we're going to be discussing first in this flip is we're going to be talking about the Cold War conflict kind of in and of itself leading up until the 1960s, right? With the building of a very, very major institution that represents the Cold War, that being of the Berlin Wall. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, right? Let's take 2 seconds to make sure we're discussing what's going on this week and stuff like that. So first and foremost, every S period is y'all's, all right? Every S period belongs to y'all. Every morning session belongs to y'all, okay? So I will be here every morning. I will be here every S period. Big things, though, let's make sure in our little committees that we're working on our key people list, that we're working on our timelines together, and that we're really getting all this stuff done. When you're doing your key people list, make sure you give a short description of them, nothing too major, nothing over the top, okay? And if you want, somebody is more than welcome to then take that list and turn it into a Quizlet just so people can kind of go through them at their leisure when they're on their phone. If you're in the car ride with your mom somewhere, you can do it then, okay? Now, other big stuff though, right? Remember, this unit is only about 10% of the test, so I would rather take a week of time to review and get ready than go over this stuff in class. So let's dive straight in, and let's go into what we're going to do to rebuild after World War II, right? So World War II, as we know, particularly in Europe, is going to end in May of 1945, right? VE Day, I believe, is May 5th? Let me double check that real quick, or else I'm going to hate myself. VE Day. VE Day in 1945. May 8th. Dang it. All right, so anyway, May 8th, 1945 is going to be the day that Germany surrenders, Hitler kills himself, and the remaining forces of the SS are going to be rounded up by the Allies, right? Now, something you need to understand is that the Allies were pretty confident that they were going to win the war even before this occurred, right? So the Allies had held conferences, multiple of them, before Germany even actually surrendered. The first one being the Tehran Conference in 1943. Why is that year so significant? 1943 is going to be years following the Germans breaking of the non-aggression pact with Stalin, right? So they're going to actually deliberately attack the Soviet Union. And so Stalin is going to join up with the Allies. As of 1943, America is now also involved, and they're sweeping through North Africa with the Allied British forces, right? And in 1943, France is still under occupation, right? So the big 3 go off and they meet in Tehran, Iran, right? But victory is on the horizon. When France became liberated by this point, okay, they then hold the Yalta Conference. Now, the Yalta Conference is going to be a meeting in Yalta, all right? So, and look at these little guys. There's Joseph Stalin right there, not looking like a mass murderer, but he is. And then we've got very feeble, very brittle FDR, right? As you can see, he is getting much older, and he is succumbing to many parts of his illnesses, and he has not got too much time left on the planet, right? So he's also smoking a cigarette like a boss. All right, so now, and then you got, of course, little Winston Churchill right here, just being a little old man smoking a cigar and being like, rah, rah, rah. There's so many things about Winston Churchill's like personality that I wish I got a chance to talk to y'all about in class. For example, he was a notorious big loved cigars, loved whiskey, right? Loved to drink. And apparently one time he was being interviewed by a woman, and she said, it is like the woman thing will come up in a second. So she was interviewing him, and she said, "Sir, I think you're drunk." And he goes, "Ma'am, at least when I wake up in the morning, I'll be sober. And when you wake up in the morning, you'll still be ugly," right? So like Winston Churchill, hilarious to have at a party. All right, so now the Yalta Conference, though, is going to happen in 1945 with victory very close on the horizon. And what is going to be agreed upon at the Yalta Conference is to divide Germany into 4 occupational zones. Because as of the last war, we realized there are 2 things we need to not do. 1, do not punish Germany for these things directly. And 3, do not make them pay all the war reparations on their own. And 2, see what I did there, 1, 3, 2, because I'm jumping around a little bit. 2, you need to make sure that you have an exit strategy plan, okay? So the big thing to come up with, though, divide Germany into 4 occupational zones. And what we're going to do is demilitarize it, and we're going to denazify it, right? So the big thing about demilitarization, you are going to remove the German military and force them back into their regular everyday lives. And then you're also going to denazify Germany by removing symbols, propaganda, and rooting out subversive ideas and Nazi party leaders, right? So now a big part of the denazify question were these things known as the Nuremberg trials, okay? Jot that down, Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials were actually held in 19 1945, 46, and 47, the Nuremberg trials. And they are going to be trials specifically set up to actually hold Nazi leaders accountable for their actions, right? And actually, you can see several different pictures from these. Some of the most famous being Nazi leaders that are being directly questioned and are on trial. And you can see a giant list right here of the different Nazi leaders that were actually going to be held and their sentencing, right? And as you can see, most of them resulted in death, right? Death, acquitted, life imprisonment, death, life imprisonment. Rudolf Hess is an interesting one. He actually parachuted into Great Britain, running away from Hitler, knowing that the Germans were going to lose, and he actually gave up a lot of Nazi secrets to the Allies, so they just gave him life imprisonment, right? So he probably deserved worse. Now, anyway, but jumping off of it, though, so denazify, a big component of the denazification is, of course, the Nuremberg trials, right? And then you had the Poland question. Now, the Poland question was, what do we do with Poland, right? Germany goes in and takes it over. They split it in half with the Soviets. So Stalin, maybe you should give Poland up. And Stalin goes, all right, so, and refuses to give Poland up and says that the Soviets need to create a buffer zone, just like the Rhineland, and look how that went. A buffer zone between them and the Western European countries to prevent them from direct invasion, just like that happened again with the Germans. So ironically enough, he refuses to give Poland up, and the Allies relent, and they let him keep the eastern half of Poland, right? So Russia, though, also as a part of this, is being forced to join the United Nations. The United Nations is a new collaborative group that is going to be chartered in 1945, okay, and is going to be created as a better version of the League of Nations. The United Nations will have a military. The United Nations will also have a Security Council, which will be the 5 major powers of the world that will actually sit there, meet, debate, and coalesce to understand how to avoid war in the future. But it is meant to be a more efficient system rather than the League of Nations, which you would just say, don't do that, and people like Japan would just leave, right? So now the big thing, though, is this is the map of Germany, right? As you can see, this is the British zone, this is the Russian zone, this is the American zone, and this is the French zone, right? Now, it had nothing to do with the problems of getting Britain and France to give their territories back. The issues lied with the Russians giving their territories back, okay? So this is going to actually end up splitting Germany in half and creating a West Germany and an East Germany when Stalin refuses to relent and he continues Soviet domination of Eastern Germany. Now, interesting little thing, though, is as you can see this little nugget right here that has all these little different colors. That's the city of Berlin, right? So the city of Berlin was then also divided into 4 different sectors. So you had a West Berlin and an East Berlin, right? Now, weird thing that's going to happen is that Eastern Berlin side is going to get a wall built all the way around it, right? But then, following that, this idea, the Potsdam Conference makes it official. So this idea, this plan to divide Europe was floated out at first at the Yalta Conference, and at the Potsdam Conference, it was officially made, specifically true. There is, of course, Winston Churchill, and by the Potsdam Conference, unfortunately, FDR has died. So Harry S. Truman represented the United States at the Potsdam Conference, and then, of course, there's Old Uncle Joe, as he was called by a lot of people in the United States, Joseph Stalin. The German division will be finalized, but however, the big thing following the Potsdam Conference is that Truman began to grow very nervous and wary of Stalin and the Soviets because communism was beginning to spread. China was going through the middle of their communist revolution. North Korea had just gone through their first phases of their communist revolution, right? And at a commencement speech in the United States, following this meeting in 1946, Churchill stood upon a stand at an American college, the College of Westminster, and said, I have terror and deepness, sadness in my heart because an iron curtain has befell Europe, right? And so as you can see, political cartoons began to come out showing things like Stalin taking more than he actually believes he needs. So here's Europe, and China is coming into the Soviet fold as well because they're going through the middle of their communist revolution. And also looking at this over here, as you can see, Europe is growing very nervous, just like Truman is, of the encroaching Soviet and communist class under Stalin, right? So as you can see, Stalin not only controlled Soviet Russia, but also controlled all of these political and economic countries right here, like Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and many other areas of the like, right? So anyway, continuing forward though, you still got to keep rebuilding after World War II, right? So this brought rise to the Truman Doctrine, right? The idea of let us do our best to keep communism behind that Iron Curtain, right? So Winston Churchill believed that the Iron Curtain was like right here. You see with this line that divides like Soviet societies and the capitalist Western societies? Big things that they're saying is like, this is the Iron Curtain, according to Winston Churchill, saying that that is the line where communism starts and stops in Europe, right? So the Truman Doctrine gave way to the idea of let's contain communism. Let's keep it behind that wall. Let's keep it behind there and keep it back into like Eastern Europe. And in the ashes of the failed Dawes Plan, the Marshall Plan will rise, right? So the big key differences between the Marshall Plan and the Dawes Plan mostly has to do with how is it being done. They both hinge on the same idea, though. Give money to Europe for them to rebuild themselves as fast as possible to prevent another war. But in this context, it was give Europe enough money to rebuild themselves as fast as possible, to beef up their economies, to prevent anybody in these other Western countries from wanting to convert to communism, right? Now, the other big interesting idea is that Dawes plans were loans, right? The U.S. loaned money to Germany that would then give money to France that would then eventually be paid back to us, right? In that big circular like havoc that we talked about in class. And then when the stock market crashed, the Dawes plan like funds went right there with it, right? But the Marshall Plan is not based on this. The Marshall Plan is direct grants, the giving of money to European countries to rebuild their societies, rebuild their countries, and rebuild their cities and people to establish strong economic and cultural bases that would prevent the spread of communism on their own. Now, of course, it would be, why was it adopted? It was adopted to prevent the spread of communism. And this third thing, was it effective? Surprisingly enough, yes. All right, so like George C. Marshall's plan, the Secretary of State at the time, was actually a very effective plan. Like it actually really helped these Western European countries recover like that. And none of them ever went on to actually become what would be known as one of the Eastern Bloc states, right? And whew, it's getting kind of cold in here, right? So you can put my elevator window open. The Marshall Plan is considered the start of the Cold War, right? Because the Marshall Plan set in stone that really long line right there known as the Iron Curtain, right? So the Iron Curtain would be the dividing line now between coalitions of countries that would actually line themselves up based on these two new names, right? So all of your Eastern countries over here entered into this thing known as the Warsaw Pact, right? The Warsaw Pact was a coalition of countries that believed in strict socialist, intense communistic ideas when it comes to the regulation of economies, regulation of people, and the regulation of the middle class. Whereas NATO was like founded around the idea of free market capitalist countries, especially that of Western Europe and also including the United States, right? NATO stands for, by the way, just give you a heads up, NATO stands for North American Treaty Organization, right? But these two countries would be the representative bodies between the communist Eastern Europe and the capitalist Western Europe, right? The Warsaw Pact countries were over here, the NATO countries were over here. They also had two nicknames that you should jot down right next to this. The Warsaw Pact was known as the Eastern Bloc, the NATO Pact, or the NATO group was known as the Western Bloc, right? So, Cold War, though. Why is it called a Cold War? Well, it's called a Cold War because it's a war that never truly was hot in Europe, okay? And what I mean by hot in Europe is shots weren't necessarily fired between countries in Europe. Instead, it was a Cold War due to the fact that there were arms races, nuclear buildups, and spies. Oh my. So basically what I'm getting at is the first thing we'll talk about, elements of a Cold War, is the arms races, right? The United States and the Soviets began to compete against one another to try and create as much military surplus stock as they possibly could in case they ever actually went to war, and they, funnily enough, never even ended up using it. Well, the Americans ended up using it in Vietnam, but like the Americans never used it against Soviet targets directly, right? So the arms races is just general military buildup, much like the arms race we talked about in World War I with the Anglo-German arms race, right? Except the Anglo-German arms race is about boats. Now look, then we've also got nuclear weapons, okay? Some of you are like, but Mr. Terry, I thought that America only had nukes. No, false. As of 1949, the Russians tested their first successful nuclear device, right? So the Russians began to build up nuclear arms as fast as possible. Now, the Americans already had this process streamlined, and we ended up having like twice as many of them by the time the nuclear arms race was over, and they never stood a chance at actually building as many as we are. But unfortunately, they're glorified paperweights due to a thing that we're about to talk about here in 2 seconds, mutually assured destruction. Now, anyway, and then spies. So some people believe that there was a giant coalition of spies that were actually spying in Russia for the Americans and spying in like Western Europe for the Soviets. And several would be accused in the United States. Some would be rooted out in the Western countries. But apparently this was all very real. And this one right here, these are the Rosenbergs. This is the Rosenberg couple. Both of these people will be put to death for espionage, right? And apparently his son has recently come out and said that there's probably a good chance that Joseph Rosenberg was actually, or was it Edward Rosenberg? Well, the male Rosenberg, Mr. Rosenberg, actually probably was a Soviet spy, but his wife, Mrs. Rosenberg, had no idea, right? But she ends up getting electrocuted to death via the electric chair regardless, right? So the accusation of different people being spies becomes a very, very big thing, right? And also you see a blow up in propaganda as well, right? Stop communism, it's everybody's job. And you've got this guy right here who is saying like the swords of democracy will fight against like the era of communism. And this right here, I believe, is supposed to be the Philippines. Now, anyway, so really, really quick, then you have this, right, the spreading of communism, right? As you can see, this is Russia over here in the east, and Lenin is saying forward, and to spread communism forward into the western territories of Europe, right? So also, you've got some shenanigans going on between these different countries. This one's one of my favorite ones. This is the Berlin airlift, right? So since Berlin had a capitalist side and a communist side, because it was separated into 4 different quadrants, you also had this communist side, and the Americans and the allies under NATO decided to drop supplies and different things on top of the communist sides of Germany, and particularly the city of Berlin, right? They would land a plane in the allied side, they'd suit this thing up full of stuff like food and clothes and different capitalist goods like candy and things like that, and they would actually drop it off little parachutes onto waiting crowds below on the communist side of Europe. And apparently this is a bunch of school children hoping to catch a parachute of candy so they can go home and be like, look, capitalism's all the rage, Mom. And so like actually this was a direct like screw you basically from the capitalist side of Berlin to the communist side, right? And this would also help inspire this thing known as the Red Scare, or the Second Red Scare, which actually is going on in the 1950s and 60s in the United States, and this fear of communism that is about to encroach upon us and is going to come and take all of our things from us and things like that. So this Cold War revolves around arms races, nukes, spies, apparently. There was another spy, too, that was accused. Alger Hiss was a big one. And then also propaganda as well, and definitely like deliberate tactics, which led to the Red Scare. The Cold War leads to the Red Scare. I'll show you a video tomorrow in class about the Red Scare, right? His name's Bert the Turtle. He's my favorite. All right, so now so what you're going to see is the rise of these 2 superpowers during this Cold War. It's the United States versus the Soviet Union, right? Or basically, it's the United States and its allies in Western Europe and the Soviet Union and its allies all over the world, right? Including China, including North Korea, and the hopes that they have of actually spreading communism even further, right? So the big thing, though, also you have to understand is that the Soviet Union is one area, right? The USSR, also known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But the Soviets still dominated some other places as well. So if we go all the way back, to that propaganda or the political cartoon I was showing you of Stalin, looking like he's stretching over Europe and stuff like that. If we go all the way back to this real quick, you'll see what I'm talking about. So Stalin did not technically own these Eastern Bloc countries because they weren't in the Soviet Union, but however, the Soviet military and the Soviet, like in the USSR army, dominated them. They placed military units in them. They specifically placed politicians in charge in hopes of actually showing the domination of these countries by Soviet ideas, and also of by Soviet and socialist economic policies, right? For example, I've been to Prague before in the Czech Republic. The city of Prague still has some very, very, very Soviet holdover things. For example, the ugliest building in Europe is considered to be in Prague, and it's this giant Soviet TV antenna, right? So and it's like this huge thing that sticks out above the entire city, and it's really ugly, right? So now, and then Hungary also was under the control of the Soviets during this time period. If you ever go to Hungary and to Budapest, a lot of street vendors love to sell old Soviet like pins and stuff like that. Czechoslovakia is a big one, Poland, because they wanted this buffer zone, right, to prevent the direct invasion of the Russians and of the USSR. These countries were under this thing called Comcon, right? And Comcon is the idea of the coalition of something. I can never remember what it is, but it's like mutual economic agreement or something like that. Hold on, let's see what CumCon stands for real fast. Oh, here we go. CumCon actually is supposed to be abbreviated to CMEA in English. That is the by name, but it means the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, right? So basically, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland are under this Council of Mutual Economic Assistance by the Soviet Union, and they're trying to prevent the spread of capitalism into the USSR by creating this big buffer zone, right? So these countries, since they were under CumCon, though, are going to probably eventually be like, hey, bro, how do you like my new Levi's? Well, under Soviet rule, you're not allowed to wear jeans because they're a product of the dirty, rotten capitalist pigs, right? So, like, the big thing, though, for example, is because of this stuff, there is going to be multiple different uprisings against this, right? So the suppression of freedoms that are going to occur in Soviet-dominated places like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, we'll talk about Hungary and Czechoslovakia specifically here in a minute, are going to kind of strike fear into many of those NATO states, right? Now, an interesting thing happens, though, in 1953, and Stalin dies, right? Stalin dies, and this guy takes over. His name is Nikita Khrushchev, right? You mad, bro? Well, Nikita Khrushchev is entering into a very interesting dilemma, right? So he has got to now take on the fact that he is the very first premier of the Soviet Union, post-Stalin and post-personality cult created by Stalin. So the first thing that Nikita Khrushchev realizes is that the Soviets have entered into a period known as MAD with the Americans, and the Americans have entered into it with them as well. And what that means is mutually assured destruction, in the sense that stop building up all these nuclear arms, because if we all have this many and I fire one at you and you fire one at me, we're all dead, right? So we basically now have all these nuclear arms as giant paperweights, right? So, but that's mutually assured destruction, and the policy will be adopted under Khrushchev. But he does take on a bigger thing. He wants to de-Stalinize, much like the Allies denazified Germany. He wants to create a new USSR. First and foremost, he wants to dismantle the image of the premier. And what I mean by the premier is the leader of the Soviet Union. Here is Vladimir Lenin. He was the premier. Here is Joseph Stalin. He is the premier. And notice really quickly that they are being glorified and cultified with these two guys right here, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. He wants to get rid of this. He wants to move away from that, and he wants to move to a different understanding of the premier, that he is an official of a country with some type of economic policy. So he begins to kind of just bring a softer image of the entire premier person, right? Now, also, he wants to disassociate the USSR with extremism, and with the extremism under Stalin, like the Great Purges, right? He wants to create a place that doesn't look so intensely gory and genocidal on the outside, right? So he wants to disassociate with that. And another big thing is he also believes in disassociating with extremism. We must close the gulags. So he closed the gulag work camps that Stalin used to use for a very, very long time to punish the people in his Great Purges. He also wants to disassociate the extremist idea of killing all the kulaks and stuff like that. So now some of y'all are like, oh, Khrushchev, you're a nice guy. Well, is he nice or is he not? Because there's going to be some revolts, right? So, like, under the CumCon stuff, you have to understand that some people are going to decide to revolt against Soviet oppression and Soviet rule because it strips away and takes away the choice of normal people, right? Where you do this, where you do that, where you buy your goods, how you get your goods, how much you work, how much you're taxed, how much you're this, how much you're that. So this stuff is what kind of scares a lot of modern-day capitalists in a lot of ways because they don't want those things to happen. Now, that's not the ideas of socialism. That's the ideas of an oppressive USSR placing restrictive boundaries on freedoms within these countries that they control. This right here, for example, is a very famous shot from the Hungarian student revolt that took place in 1956. A very popular image of the Hungarian student revolt was taking the communist symbol from the flag of Hungary and cutting it out. As you can see, there was a flag with a hole in it. And then also, right here, you can see a very, very famous memorial from the Hungarian student revolt. All of these little black balls are actually markers for where bullets hit this building, because the Soviets came in and forcefully suppressed and destroyed the Hungarian student revolt and actually killed people in the streets. And if you ever get a chance to go to Budapest, there are memorials for it everywhere, right? And then, of course, right here is the Prague Spring, which happened in 1968, another very, very large uprising against Soviet rule that occurred in Prague in the Czech Republic. It would also be forcefully suppressed by the Soviets, though, okay? So the Soviets would actually send their military in, and they would actually, stop these uprisings, 100%, okay? And they would use violence to do so. So you might have de-Stalinized Russia and the USSR, Khrushchev, but you're still kind of mean, and you're, destroying people's right to freedom of speech and stuff. Now, anyway, so the 1960s, though, another big problem presents itself. The Truman Doctrine is failing, okay? Because communism is spreading. Communism is now officially spread to China because they have gone completely communist as of their 1939 revolution, to North Korea, to Vietnam. As of 1955, the northern territory of Vietnam begins to try and go to communism under their leader, Ho Chi Minh, right? But a big one that happened is Cuba, right? So as you can see right here, here is Khrushchev and here is Castro, because Cuba went to communism as of 1961. Now, this is going to lead to the classification system of first, second, and third world countries, right? First world countries were capitalist countries that could be allies with the United States. They were decently developed, and they were actually capitalist in government nature and economic nature as well. Second world countries were communist-controlled countries, right? So Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, China, the USSR, most of your Eastern Bloc countries. Your third world countries, that's the places that are not economically developed yet, and they are kind of up for grabs between the first and the second, okay? So the big thing, though, going forward is you're also going to see a number of hot wars that can happen outside of Europe, right? Those big ones being the Korean War, which happened between American forces and the communist-controlled forces of North Korea, also with the aid of the Communist Party of China as well. The Korean War is going to be a big thing you're going to learn about next year a lot. The Vietnam War, which lasted for 20 years and led to the death of 50,000 different American soldiers. The Vietnam War lasted from 1955 to 1975. That's going to be a hot war against communism that occurs, and that's a part of the Truman Doctrine, right? The idea of if someone, so you have to understand, there's the Stalin Doctrine and the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was if anybody tries to go communist, we're going to go in there and try to stop it using force. And Stalin's idea was this: if any of our countries try to go capitalist, we're going to go in there and stop it using force, right? And then there was also the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was actually heavily protested at this game, the miracle game that happened whenever the U.S. won the Olympic gold medal in the 1980s. So the big thing, though, you have to understand is the last thing is how do you deal with defectors, right? So as you can tell, we've got hot wars going on outside of Europe. We've got communism is spreading. We got all these crazy things. And we also have the direct suppression of free speech and uprising against the Soviet influence in places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, right? So really quick, are some of these people going to decide to start running away? Well, yeah, and one of the biggest cities where a lot of them decided to run away or to defect to the other side of Berlin, where they could then get out and get to West Berlin, which was the capitalist side of Berlin, it's going to lead to the construction of this thing known as the Berlin Wall, right? So the Berlin Wall will be constructed in 1961 to try and keep defectors from leaving the Soviet side, right? And so yet again, this is all just a crazy bunch of stuff going on in this Cold War era, but this is going to continue forward until the USSR finally falls, right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that stuff a little bit later on. That is a great crash course video number 1. I'll see y'all soon for the big meat and potatoes part in the middle, and then a very short one at the very end. Y'all are doing great. You're going to kill this AP test. I also have a couple of links down in the description below about how to write your DBQ, how to write your LEQ. Y'all have a good one.